In our study of the life divine, we have begun the chapter titled Man and the Evolution, where Sri Aurobindo takes us to the core principles of the evolutionary process and prepares through that discussion how those principles will operate in the next step in our spiritual evolution from a mental human to a superconscious, supramental humanity. In the passage we have so far looked at, we saw him describing the struggle of consciousness emerging out of inconscience and the means by which it makes that emergence, and then a long interlude where he takes up the question of whether at all there has to be a sense of evolution, because there are traditions and there is a rational basis for declaring that evolution as it appears to us is in fact a very static arrangement of different levels of grades of consciousness or types of creatures exhibiting special qualities, but there is no particular transition taking place from one type to another. The horse remains horse, whether it is stronger, weaker, more adapted, less adapted, while the zebra remains zebra even within its adaptations. You do not see the zebra becoming horse or horse becoming zebra, and we have no evidence so far of any creature making a transition from one type to another. We see types and variations within types. So Sri Aurobindo takes up this whole question. Do we at all need the concept of an evolution where something is transitioning between types, and at all should there be something like a goal towards which this whole movement is growing? And he first formulates all the objections to the evolutionary theory. The whole concept that there is no need for evolution, and all the things that are explained by this non-requirement of evolution itself. We still accept rebirth, we still accept 7 principles of creation, we still accept the karmic working, but even then you do not need evolution to explain what you see. So here we have seen how he described in the last portion of our study the various types and how those types operate and how there are gradations of different consciousness, and within each various types of special quality or power which have emerged. But none of these still require an evolution. In the process, though, he is still revealing the deeper principles by which the types are formed. How does a particular type emerge? And so in justifying this position, Sri Aurobindo is still pointing out to us the deeper processes hidden behind, and later from here he will grow to the evolutionary perspective which builds on this knowledge. Nothing of this is rejected. This is the reason why it is useful for us to study this passage, even though he is taking a position which seems to be contrary to the evolutionary. The fact is that this perspective has deep, profound insights of relevance for us. How these gradations have come, and he has described in the last portion that we had read, how behind every type there is as if a smaller version and a still smaller version, all the way to a tiniest version. So there is an original plasm which multiplies and creates living units of a particular type which grow to become more complex units and more complex variations. He uses even this phrase of infinitesimal forms of vegetable life and infinitesimal animalcules. And in fact, we see this quite distinctly in the way the forms of plants originate from an earliest kind of plant material which is single-celled. We see these in the oceans. They are plankton which take the sunlight, are effectively plants and yet pretty much single-celled, or out of them clusters of cells which form, and then clusters of those clusters which make for a kind of a mossy mass. And interestingly, within the mossy mass, we see communication which is electrical taking place, as well as exchange of nutritional material, although extremely slowly, not in the sense of an organized body. And yet all of these are visible as stages of organization emerging from one unit, which always remains the unit of plant life. And then suddenly we have a more complex independent plant type and a still more complex plant type, and so on. And the same we can see for also animals. There are tiny animals which feed on this plankton. And in the ocean there is a particular type which is called a krill, which eats that, and which is eaten by the fish, which is eaten by larger fish, which is eaten by the whales. And so you have a whole spectrum in size and in range of qualities. All this having been described, Sri Aurobindo now takes up the question of what compels for changes within the type. There's also an important discussion which we saw last time of how within the body, in the human body for example, we see the stages of development in the embryo all the way to the human type. But all these stages still exist in the ape, stopping at the ape, still exist at the four-footed animal, stopping at the four-footed. Why do they stop? And the fact that there are these stages does not in itself imply that we have gone through those stages in the evolution. These are important points he has made. It could simply be that nature finds it convenient to build in this way a more complex type. And that's all. And then he speaks of other forces which are driving change or even adaptation. So all these he describes also intermediate types that may appear, something which are half amphibious, half land, but still it does not mean that there has been a transition from one to the other. It's just a type that came. In nature, we have every now and then certain odd types. They are so odd that they don't fit our categorization. You will see in your school textbooks, they will speak of different types of mammals. There is the amphibious, and then there is the land-based, and then there is the type which lays an egg, and there's a type which carries the child in the womb. You create for your convenience these types and declare, well, that's how it has to be because that's how it is. It's a very circular logic. And so every now and then nature throws something which does not fit within your categories. And one of those classic examples is what is called the duck-billed platypus. And it is a creature which at the same time swims in water, also lives on land. It lays an egg but also carries its child within its womb. The egg is inside it. And there are 2 or 3 cross sections like that where you do not know which category to put it in. And it just shows you that nature is not bound by any such categorizations. We make categorizations for our convenience, but for nature there is nothing like this. So he has reference also to this type which is intermediate, but still it's not evidence that something evolved out of something else. Then he goes to the forces. Other forces than hereditary variation have been at work in bringing about the appearance of new characteristics. So far we looked at, or science believed, that somehow in the mix of the parentage there is a variation which is hereditary, which makes for a new variation of either type or some capacity. But he says there are other forces. There are physical forces such as food, light rays, and others that we are only beginning to know. There are surely others which we do not yet know. So he's writing this 100 years ago, but it is an assumption that we can always make that when Sri Aurobindo points to something and then says there are other reasons, but even if he points to something, he points to it because there is more to it than appears. And so let's just look at this. Food is certainly a major force of change, but not so superficially. The superficial understanding is that, well, the food in a particular place has become now less available because there is a climatic change, and so certain plants don't grow, other plants which still grow now become the food, and so animals have to evolve or change to adapt. And one of the reasons given for the giraffe's long neck is that it had to somehow eat taller and taller plants, and so it stretched out its neck. If you think about it, it's convenient to believe it, and it's a nice story to tell children, but there is no evidence at all that such a thing was actually the process by which it grew its long neck or grew its long legs. But still, it seems to be, yes, it makes reasonable sense that food becoming a critical element of survival could be the main modifier of many of the types, and even developing new powers of adaptability. If we discover that a food has gone out of access, we adapt ourselves now not only to find other types of food, but also to be able to eat food which earlier was not comfortable for us. We find, for example, certain types of food will cause indigestion for some human beings, but for others it is a staple diet. And we cannot explain that except to say there has been an adaptation. But there's something even more complex. We suggest that because of adaptation of food, even our intelligence has grown. Because when we could not find food which had grown naturally, we began to cultivate food, and with that our power of thinking grew. When the food became more stable, we had a free mind to explore other things, so the intelligence developed. All of these are supposed statements in the existing evolutionary theory, but they are forces. Food is certainly a major one. What is not so obvious, at least it was not obvious 100 years ago, which now has become extremely important, is that with food we are also ingesting genetic material from other species. And this is all coming into a domain of exploration called epigenetics. If you eat a fruit, let's say you eat an apple, the genetic material of the cells in the apple is within a few minutes, let's say half an hour, spread into your bloodstream and can be detected. What does that mean? With your bloodstream, the genetic content of the apple cells is being spread and is being absorbed by the cells of your own body. And the epigenetics is the part which the genetics activates to make changes in the cellular behavior. This epigenetic content of the apple cells is interacting with your own epigenetic content. So it's like within an hour of eating fruit, your body is full of the epigenetics of that fruit interacting with your epigenetics and making changes probably. And this evidence did not exist 100 years ago, which now we are able not only to measure, but the implications of this are staggering. One of the implications is horizontal transfer of genetic material from one species to another. And it's happening all the time. The evidence for this is growing more and more, especially through the epigenetic mechanism, that just the fact that we are interacting with species by eating content from the other species makes for a huge transfer. But a mosquito taking blood and then biting another person and transferring part of that would also involve transfer of some genetic material. We have also transference that takes place through pollen across species barriers. Now, the species still does not change when the epigenetic material goes in. And so it supports at the same time that there is a fixed type within which there can be an exchange without losing the fixed type. And so you can play the argument both ways. You can say, well, all of this would make for a rich interchange which would explain rapid change, but also you can say with all the rich interchange you still don't have wheat becoming rice or something intermediate between wheat and rice. So it's as if something is holding the type of wheat to remain wheat and rice to remain rice. With modern genetic intervention, we are actually breaking those barriers. We are taking material from two types and mixing in a way that makes for a new type, which again we have difficulty categorizing. With a GMO food, we are taking genes from animals, implanting them into vegetables to make for what? Let's say you have a tomato into which they have implanted genes from a pig. Yes, they've done that. And the result is the tomato has skin which approaches the living tissue of the pig or any other living animal. In other words, it becomes harder, thicker, but it still remains tomato. So here's the problem. With all those experimentation, we see variation within the type, but the type still remains the strong center. We have not created a tomato which is walking and talking like a pig. That does not yet happen. So food is an important part. Then he mentions light rays. Again, if you go back to 100 years ago, they would have said, all right, and there is a superficial explanation that because of light rays, the skin becomes browner, or lack of light rays makes the skin fairer, and all of these variations which are still superficial. Today's understanding takes us deeper. We recognize the material which makes the skin grow brown from exposure to light, sunlight in particular, is a substance called melanin, which is emerging from a precursor which is called tyrosine. And from tyrosine there is melanin, and there is also neuromelanin which is emerging. And melanin and neuromelanin are very close to each other, although following different pathways of activation. Still, what it shows you, and this goes back all the way to the fetus level of development, the same process which makes for the skin color makes for the hair color, which makes for the eye color. So that is the first discovery. Well, this is still 20 or 30 years old, maybe more. But the more recent discovery is that this same material is directly impacting the growth of the neurons and the entire nervous system and the brain. So here's something fascinating. If there is increased melanin production in the fetus level, the nervous system also has increased melanin, and particularly neuromelanin. The melanin makes for the nervous system to become more hardy. It does not degenerate so easily. It repairs itself more easily. It has anti-cancer properties. It has properties of making the signals in the nervous system to move faster. Now, practically, it means a person whose eyes are more dark will have a nervous system which is more rapidly responsive. When reacting to, let's say, a threat, a ball which is coming to your head moves back, your eyes close. The reflex itself is faster for those in whom the melanin content is larger at an early stage of development. Now what you're seeing here, which is fascinating, is that superficial form of the response to light has deep consequences all the way to the working of the nervous system and the resilience of the body to illnesses, and in particular to destruction from any genetic abnormality. So, in fact, where melanin is stronger, the melanin is a natural remover of toxins and it prevents cancer from emerging, but also it has a power which is called chelation. If in your body you have heavy metals or any other toxins which have come in, melanin binds to it and removes it from your body. And one more, which is the term used, the oxidation which takes place, antioxidants. Melanin has an antioxidant property which prevents the breakdown of cells by stress of various kinds, including radiation stress, by the way. Now here you have light as a major influence which can change entirely the inner working, not just the superficial skin color. And so what we are seeing is a few pointers that Sri Aurobindo has shown, which were well known at the time, though superficially known, have much more profound effects. And this is one of the interesting things which we discover with the increasing knowledge of genetic functioning, is that although a particular gene is responsible for one particular, let's say, development, it has influence on everything else. The genetic programming is not an intellectual programming like a computer program that you write, where one part looks after another thing, another part looks after another thing. It seems to be richly interdependent, which is a characteristic of a grade of knowledge which is above the intellect. It does not make simple cuts and divisions of functions. The interdependence makes for it to be much more complex. It is a more holistic awareness which develops into specialized parts, but still retains its holistic interdependence. So these are just some observations. And then others, he says, other forces, physical, that we are only beginning to know. And having accepted this, he takes it to the next level. There are at work invisible life forces and obscure psychological forces, which are also responsible for this kind of change. And of this, 100 years ago, we had very little evidence. Today's evidence is extraordinary. So, invisible life forces are, for example, the changes that take place from stress. The fact that a rat family has been put under a certain kind of stress makes for epigenetic changes within them, which then transmit into their children as genetic changes. And those children, although never having been exposed to that stress, still carry the markers of having been through that stress. And you can go down a couple of generations and you will find in those generations, although never experienced with that stress, when the stress comes, they have the ability to handle it better. So it's as if the parental development, psychological, not physical, the psychological adaptation in the parents is also being transmitted into the children. Now if you take this at a very crude level, amplify it now to a more refined level, which is taught generally in all cultures, that a mother who is pregnant should be surrounded by aesthetic, beautiful, harmonious, happy environment, because that will have a huge imprint on the child's character and psychology. And this is the belief that is present because the evidence is also present in so many families across the generations, but it came from this deeper insight that in fact in the transmission, not only at a genetic level, but even in the fetus formation, the imprints which are psychological and not merely physical do modify all through life. They leave an imprint. Another example I may give, which is of course food related, but still it shows the long-term impact. Babies which have been brought up with the artificial baby foods, the milk powder and the things which they encourage you to replace human milk by, in the first 2 years, and after that the child goes to normal food. All babies who have been exposed to those artificial products, for the rest of their lives they have a struggle with obesity. Now this is the evidence we have, we don't know why. But it shows you that an imprint made at an early stage of childhood, even though the imprint is removed, can have long-term consequences. And if there is a psychological imprint, that too can have long-term consequences of this kind. So Sri Aurobindo is pointing to all these invisible life forces. And here the suggestion is more profound. An invisible life force may be of an environmental kind where you are not even conscious of. Now, one of the observations we have is if you live in a place which is extremely beautiful, where lots of food, lots of luxurious growth of nature exists, you will find people there are also laid back, content, and have a certain temperament. So you see on those, typically the images you have in the media is tropical islands where people go for a holiday. lots of coconut trees, lots of fresh fruits, and everything is abundant. What are the people like? You don't see them hardworking. You don't see them struggling to survive. You don't see them being extraordinarily creative in their mental faculties. They are also laid back, happy-go-lucky, aligning to the quality of energy of nature in that space. And so this is one of those invisible life forces. That is the kind of life energy that nature has organized in a particular space, which is initially of the type of land, later of the type of plants and animals, and then influences also the type of humanity there, makes for a particular psychological orientation. It does not mean either that people who grow up in deserts, who have to struggle for their life, are any more creative. That also does not happen. They are just more hardy, more hardened for survival. That's about it. Where does the creativity come? And you'll find spaces which are highly creative, where not only people grow up to be creative, but people who come to live there tend to acquire those creative traits. Now, it's not by chance that Bombay is the hub of the Indian economy. It's not by chance that Silicon Valley is the hub of technological development. It's not by chance that a particular city becomes the seat of political power. There are in history many examples where they tried to move the seat of political power because of weather or some other conveniences, and it never worked. We have the example of Delhi, where at some point the emperors decided, well, it's too hot, so let's move to a cooler climate. It did not work. The British tried it. It did not work. There's something to do with a space which is more attuned because of the quality of life energy there, either for comfort and abundance of comfort, or for high intellectual work, or energy of economy and transaction, trade, or of political power, or just hardiness and barrenness and struggle. There are also spaces which are rich for the quality of the subtlety of culture, which also associates with a particular space. And somehow, people there being that, they attract other people. But what is interesting is, those who go there, they feel, here I feel my inspiration stronger, elsewhere it is not so strong. And you could say it's a human field, but there's more to it. It has to do with nature's energy also in that space. So these are invisible life forces. And then he speaks of obscure psychological forces. Now what those are? They are so obscure that it's not obvious. Let's take an example of what would be an obscure psychological force. What makes for a fashion? Think about that. Why does a wave of fashion happen which makes a large number of people want something for a while, and then it dies down, and another wave and another fashion? And these are also sometimes determining human interests. So for a while, for a particular period, in a particular culture, there was great importance given to knowledge. What determined it, we don't know. But for that period, everyone was craving knowledge. The wealthiest who can afford now to buy any comfort would give the money to gain knowledge, to access knowledge. And the man who had the knowledge could command even the wealthy. And then there's a shift that takes place. And now suddenly everybody is craving money. And the man who has the knowledge is dismissed because knowledge is not important. And he, if he wants to be successful, must crave wealth, which is not of his interest primarily. And then there's something else, a change that takes place, and there's a whole focus on skill of art of a certain type. And the artist is looked up to like a demigod, and the wealthy will fall at his feet, or the knowledge ones will go and serve him. What makes for those changes? And that's why he says obscure psychological forces. It's as if something where we cannot see the origin comes in, and it can sweep in a way that changes direction of human development. Why is this important? Because when suddenly an entire civilization or culture turns to this, it makes for long-term ramifications which are also there in the heredity. If an entire culture now takes a surge for fighting and domination and expansion of their influence, well, it's going to have massive impacts. We have, for example, phases in which a culture is made very refined but becomes weak. And then there is the invasion of the brute and the barbarian who seizes this culture, reduces it to a lower level, but in the process breeding a stronger gene for strength with this higher refinement which had become weak, and makes for a new type or a new variation within the type. And all of these are forces which do not have obvious physical or historical causes. In his writing on the ideal of human unity and the human cycle, Sri Aurobindo points to some of these dramatic points of change where you can see no cause, physical or psychological or historical. And yet an entire civilization turns around and moves in a different direction. And he says, if we can understand this, that's when you get the clue of what is it that is really driving human evolution and growth. So these are obscure psychological forces. Some of them may have obviously spiritual origins. Because if you cannot see a psychological cause for it, well, there must be something of a still higher level. And from there, a turn is made, a decision is made which ripples out and changes things. Earth, as a conscious being, Earth Mother, may also say, well, I have played with this now let me change the game and play with something else. And nature just changes, and a whole series of changes ripple out. For these subtler powers have to be admitted, even in the physical evolutionary theory, to account for natural selection. So very logically, he says you cannot ignore the psychological forces even if you account for physical natural selection. Who would you like to marry? Natural selection. Depends on the mood of that age. The wealthy person or the more intelligent person or the stronger person or the more skillful person, which is the fashion of the period. And it will change everything in the natural selection process. And of course, all the rest follows in terms of how you train your children according to the mood of the age. Now comes a very important insight. He says, if the occult or subconscious energy in some types answers to the need of the environment, in others remains unresponsive and unable to survive, this is clearly a sign of a varying life energy and psychology, of a conscious and a force other than the physical at work making for variation in nature. So he gives you the example which straight away proves that you have to accept the psychological principles for the simple reason that in a large group of people, let's say there is a stress of some change, energy, of life energy, of mood, of environment, of thought, of emotions. Why is it that some people answer to that and others don't? Not only some don't, there are some who can't manage that change and die out. It's fascinating when you look at lineages of family names. You will find certain family names are very common. Let's take in the European space where certain names, one of the commonest names you will find, if somebody in a movie situation, you want to be an unknown person, what do? You take a name like John Smith. Okay, so John is common, for whatever reason it's simple, short, but Smith. What makes for Smith to be common? What was a Smith? Go back 300 years and they were blacksmiths, strong, hard-working, who beat metal. And somehow the gene of that type on the male side has been dominant enough that there is a large number of Smiths. For what reason? We can say it may have something to do with the energy or the mood of the age, whatever. But we find names which become wide and then names which fade out and die out. And what's the reason for that? And some of these things are not so obvious. I'm tempted to give further examples which go quite far out. We have family lineages where, after a certain point, Suddenly you have only girls, no boys born in the family. And with that, because with marriage the girl takes the name of the man, the family name dies out. Why did that happen? And in India we have stories of curses in a family, where a family was cursed that they would no more have progeny. And you see actually suddenly nobody has children, poof, the whole lineage is gone. Or it goes through this way, that the name goes away, and so on. And there is a truth to it. These are psychological forces which do act, and they belong to that whole category which Aurobindo describes obscure psychological forces. But the question remains, why does one part answer to the changed influence, another part not answer, and a part cannot manage and die out? It's the same circumstance all around. And so he says you have to accept that even in a physical stress situation, one part adapts, one part cannot, one part dies out. And you have to accept the psychological energy within, varying life energy and psychology, which makes for the distinction, even in cause of a physical stimulus for change. The problem of the method of operation is still too full of obscure and unknown factors for any at present possible structure of theory to be definitive. So he concludes this part of the discussion with this statement. By pointing out all these finer influences, he says, we cannot make a definitive theory of what makes for these variations of types. We have physical causes, we have psychological causes, and then we have obscure psycho-spiritual causes. But how do you make a theory out of this? Well, at present, we cannot make a definitive theory. Later, he will explore those higher psychological factors and show how they, in fact, are more determinative than the physical factors. Because the psychological factor infusing into a particular type can make it hardy and adaptable to any physical change, can make it turn in preference against any other current social convention, and can actually turn the whole direction of a civilization's journey. And it can have purely a psycho-spiritual root cause, which makes for everything else. So all this right now has only provided a base on which that study later will give a final insight. It doesn't mean that there are no other forces. Yes, there are all kinds of forces. But this is more powerful than all those. In a similar discussion in one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo describes how we have three things which influence us individually. There is the imprint that the soul brings into your personality. There is the heredity which you have received, including all the psycho and other influences of your parents' thinking and feelings. Let's include those also. And then there is the environmental influence, including food, light, and everything else, which we are not conscious of. Between all three is a complex mix. So complex that you cannot make a very simple theory out of it. But the point he makes is that when these things enter in conflict, that which has the ability to override everything else is the soul's influence. So even if the environmental influence is contrary, the soul's influence asserting itself can push against, overcome, not only survive but adapt, and even utilize the contrary environment for the means that it wants, for the goal that it wants. It's very interesting to observe how two children born in the same family, maybe even twins sometimes, both experience a certain violent shock of circumstance. Let's say an accident. They fall from a tree, they experience some knock, some attack of an animal, whatever form it may be. A shock which becomes now a cause for change, a radical change. One becomes now more courageous, another now becomes more fearful. How do you explain that kind of change? And you can see it has nothing to do with genetics or the nature of the shock. It has to do with something more fundamental of how you met the shock. Not only life force, but more profoundly the soul's influence pushing forward, saying, I will never again be afraid like this, and pushes forward its power of courage and strength and growth. Or the other side, the soul's influence being weak or not present, the person says, oh my God, what if it happens again? I should protect myself, and it withdraws into a shell. Finally, it will be the soul's influence. And this is what we will see later on, that the spiritual core within us, or the spiritual core which presides over whole collective development, is the greater power which can then turn things. In spite of heredity also. And even in the case of a hereditary disease or incapacity, if the soul power comes forward, it can overcome, override, or make it a means for something even greater. We have the example which was recently greatly celebrated of a scientist who is crippled, and even on a wheelchair he cannot even speak, and yet the power of the intelligence was so great, and being given the proper means to express himself, he could convey very advanced or complex thoughts in his physical study. But clearly an inherited disease, but the mind may use that weakness of the body as a way of freeing itself from the inertia of the body to be able to access a more plastic working of the intellect. And so it's as if inevitably spirit will triumph over matter, whatever may be the circumstance thrown at it. So with this, we set aside this part of the discussion. Sri Aurobindo has given us a complex picture of these types. And where is our place in it as a human species? So we zoom in now. What's happening inside the human type? Man is a type among many types, so constructed. We have gone through exactly the same construction process. One pattern among the multitude of patterns in the manifestation in matter. He's used two words, type and then pattern. And we have to pause and see what is meant by that. So man as a type, as a human Homo sapiens is a type. One pattern has to do with the characteristics which make for that type. Now remember, the duck-billed platypus had a pattern which spanned across many categories that we created. But what makes a deer deer? What makes a zebra zebra, or an elephant, or a horse horse? Think about this. If you had to define to a child who has never seen any of these three, what would you say? They all have 4 feet, they all have a head, they all run, they all eat grass. That's the common feature. What distinguishes them? And think about how difficult it is to define the distinguishing quality. They are gentle. Yes, of course the deer is gentle. The horse also can be gentle, and the zebra also can be gentle. They are strong. They run fast. How do you distinguish? All you can say is the horse can run faster than the deer. No, that's not true either. The deer can run faster in bursts. The horse will run faster in long term. Better endurance. But maybe for short bursts the deer could go faster. How will you describe? The only description which you can have is in the experience when you see the deer leap in its run. The quality of consciousness that it puts out, a certain aesthetic, graceful movement. And the horse, when it runs, which is also graceful, but its predominant theme is of power, of energy, of strength. You come close to the horse, you feel its vitality. You ride the horse, the vitality seeps into you. When you come close to the deer, it's not the vitality which you feel, but something of its gracefulness. And if you hold the deer, it is that which you feel much more. So if you go back to the core of the characteristic, it's a bundle of common things, but highlighting something more, something less. So pattern of psychological qualities. If you remove the specific details of the skin surface of zebra and horse, it will be the pattern of energy and qualities which will distinguish one from the other. Otherwise, you fall back to just superficial description. Zebra has stripes, horse does not have stripes. But I'm sure we could breed horses which have stripes also with a little bit of genetic play, but it would still be horse and not zebra. So the pattern which you see here and the variation in pattern is what makes for man as a type as distinct from ape, as distinct from even horse. Or in fact, when you think about it more deeply, you notice in the human being there is the power to imitate something of every animal, something of the special characteristic of every animal, but in a limited degree. We can run like the horse. We can leap like the gazelle, the deer, but up to a certain point, and not quite exactly that. We can swim like the fish. We can climb trees like the ape. We can make the sounds of all these creatures, practically, interestingly. But it's as if within us, some combination of elements has been dimmed, another combination of elements, characteristics, increased. And if you just play with that, you could practically draw out every type. If you look inside the human species and look at the races within human beings, again you face the similar problem. What makes this race different from that race? Okay, there are certain elements of appearance. In this race, the forehead is slightly larger. In that race, the skin color is slightly darker or paler. But within the race variations, you will often find people who are similar to the other race. So again, it does not give you a hard distinguishing character. But what you see is rather a pattern. In this, something is highlighted, in that, something else is highlighted, in a general pattern with many variations. Now go into a particular human type. You see the professor type, the athlete type, or the artist type, the sensitive type. And again, you will see a pattern. When you go into the study of psychiatry, you discover this becomes a huge problem. How do you define psychological, illnesses? We have called them illnesses, so how do you define them? Autism. And there are degrees in autism. So finally they end up calling it autism spectrum disorder. So you can be mildly autistic or you can be extremely autistic. The problem is the mildly autistic comes so close to normal that any introvert can be described as mildly autistic. And what do? You don't have a choice. But what you can describe finally is here's a bundle of qualities. When this bunch of qualities is exaggerated or that is too weak, then we call it this disorder. Now, if you study actually the nature of autism spectrum disorder or any of the various personality disorders, you'll find 5 or 6 characteristics listed. And then what do you make of it? When is it a sickness? They'll say, when any 3 of them or 2 of them are dominant, then we will call it this. But out of 5, any 2 can dominate, but they're totally different in 5. What does it mean? All it means is, here is a pattern of behavior. You cannot limit it in a simple definition. You just have a complex pattern of tendencies, and when the tendencies spread too much this way or too little this way, you have a problem. That's all you can say. So this is where this idea of pattern comes in. A pattern of energies or capacities or powers of consciousness which vary to define a type. So now you reread the sentence. Man is a type among many types so constructed, one pattern among the multitude of patterns in the manifestation in matter. Now you can see everything is just variations of patterns of consciousness, revealed or less revealed, which make for the type. But he is the most complex that has been created, the richest in content of consciousness, and the curious ingenuousness of his building. Here's a series of superlatives, almost most complex, richest in content of consciousness, and curious ingenuousness, when compared to other animals, of course. Most complex is important. Because within us, the complexity of interaction is so much greater. When we work with animals, we realize, yes, they are so intelligent also, or they are so capable, or they are so loving, they are so whatever, sometimes better than humans, but in a very simple way. The dog's intelligence, however developed, is still compared to the human more simple. The dog's emotional spread of experience or expression, again, however more intense or pure, is more simple somehow. Within us, it's as if everything is present and everything is richly interacting with everything else. So most complex, most rich, and with it curious ingenuousness of his building. There is this, in the complexity of the way we are formed, there is a certain intelligence which is expressed. He is not speaking of how intelligent we are, ingenuousness. In the way we are formed, there is an extraordinary ingenuousness of some kind, which makes us somehow different. In the way I once tried to formulate this, it comes to this idea that in the human being, the interdependence of all the powers, the qualities of consciousness is so rich that we can easily shape ourselves to become an expert in any direction that we choose. You cannot do that with an ape. The ape can become expert only in a very narrow passage. He can swing more skillfully, he can jump more skillfully, he can be more resilient in health, but a few narrow patches. But in the human being, it's as if this complexity is so intermingled that we are able to specialize in a much larger number of directions, makes for the human species to be able now to do so many more things. He is the head of the earthly creation, but he does not exceed it. And this point will be important because later the question will come, what does it mean to exceed? So as head of earthly creation, we are still a product of all those things which gathered to make this. Even as others, so he too has his own native law, limits, special kind of existence, swabhava, swadharma. So all types of animals, creatures, even plants, have all these things. Native law. So a dolphin will swim in water, but it has to breathe outside water. A fish will swim in water, but it can breathe in water, cannot breathe outside water, etc. So those are native laws which then put limits. So the fish can only hold water, manage so much salinity. The dolphin can only hold its breath for so long, and so on. Special kind of existence. What does the fish have in its life? It has to live within the parameters which the water and the fish life cycle can provide. The dolphin can be much more free. It can actually live in a swimming pool where the water is less saline, more saline, but also it can interact with humans in a more complex way than the fish could. So there is a broader range of possibility there. But in its special kind of existence, and swabhava, natural temperament, and swadharma, which is the law of his being, which leads to its fulfillment. And I take the example of the dolphin. Innately, the dolphins are loving beings. They cannot tolerate lack of love or anger or hatred. Among themselves, they may occasionally get angry, but that's about all. What happens when you take them out of their ocean and bring them into the swimming pool, you can give them all the food they want, but the fin at the top after a while begins to droop. The drooping of the fin is a sign of depression in the dolphin. And after a while, if you're not able to get the dolphin to be happy enough, it will die of depression. Fascinating. They just die out. That's it. The life force loses interest, weakens and dies. But if you have a cluster of dolphins who can play together, then it can be happy. Or if it builds a bond with a human being strong enough that it receives that nurturing love, then it will be happy and perhaps survive. But still not as much as when it can play freely in expressing its joy in open ocean. Now here's the interesting thing. In one of the studies of dolphins, they triggered the brain of the dolphin, recognizing the center which is associated with anger. They triggered the dolphin brain and the dolphin expresses anger. And that's almost biological machinery. Next, the dolphin expresses surprise. It's surprised that it's angry. Why did I get angry? And then third step, it chooses to not get angry and stops becoming angry. And after that, they continue to stimulate the same brain center for anger, and the dolphin refused to be angry. Now, this is a level of complexity of choice which is even greater than the human being. You stimulate the anger, you say, why am I angry? I don't want to be angry, you hold back. But most human beings, you would not hold back for long. Oh, I'm getting angry. Well, that fellow deserves it, and I'll get more angry because it's fun to be angry. But in the nature of the dolphin, anger is unacceptable somehow. And that's the reason why when training a dolphin, you cannot use the normal technique of reward and punishment. This works very well with human beings. It works very well with most animals. On one side, you punish if they do wrong. On the other side, you reward when they do right. And very quickly, you shape their behavior. But with the dolphin, if you punish, it goes into depression. So the whole technique of training has to be modified, which is only love-based. Even reward is secondary. If it is not a loving reward, it has no value. So how can you train somebody without fear, without punishment, without any negative conditioning, and only love and affection? Is it possible? Yes, of course it's possible. This is how it should be. This is how human society should have always been. And the technique or technology for this kind of training is developed particularly in relation to dolphins because you have no choice. With human beings, it's easy. Throw in a little bit of fear and very quickly you get people to adapt. And so it's tempting to fall back to fear-based training. But all of this shows that the svabhava, the temperament, determines the natural line of development which gives fulfillment and even growth. You go off the svabhava, it will die out. And it's so obvious in the dolphin. And so each one has its own native law, limits, special kind of existence, svabhava, swadharma. And in the human being, it gets even more complex. Because not only we have as a human a svabhava and swadharma, and the svabhava is of being first a mental being. We cannot go back to be living like an ape based on instincts and emotions. We have to be mental, otherwise we are not human. Then we say he has regressed to an animal stage. He is no more human. And the swadharma of the mind is always to grow towards perfection, exceeding its limitations and incapacities, always growing. And its only reference is more efficient, more perfect, more true. In the domain of knowledge, which is the domain of mind, truth is the principle, the reference, the swadharma. In the domain of body, Mother says, it's the domain of form, beauty is the swadharma. So the Mother articulates it this way. In the domain of form, beauty is as important as truth is important in the domain of mind, in the domain of knowledge. Knowledge without truth, what's its value? False knowledge is not knowledge. It has no meaning. You can just throw it out. And in the physical domain, the same thing is as true in form, in beauty. If it is not beautiful, it's not worth it. In the domain of form only. Of course, we have to compromise many times. That's a different story. But if we had to look at each of the levels of consciousness, we discover each level has its own swadharma, the truth of innate truth of being, which makes it it. You go off that, it is not it. In mind, a thought which is false is not worthy of mind. And it can exist, but it has no meaning anymore. So the swadharma is then what makes the human being so important. But here's the interesting part. Within each type of human being, within each race of human types, you have variations of that svabhava, and with it some variation of swadharma. I am reminded of a child in a family which was traditionally a business family, and even within business there are many types. So there are the businessmen who build new institutions, and then there are the traders who engage with transactions. So this, I believe, was a family which had traditionally was a trader family. The child, very young, barely at the age of 4 or 5, took books which the father had been given, tore off paper from the book, rolled it up, and went around as if he is selling some product. Roasted groundnuts was common at that age, 30 years ago. So he was imitating the hawker of roasted groundnuts. And it was such a surprise, because normally a child would respect a book for something, knowing what the parents do in relation to it. But here was an imprint which was very deep. And it was obviously environmental also to some extent. But natural tendency was to go in that mode. Now, if you take a person whose natural tendency is to enter in transaction, push him into a different tendency and say, now you have to sit down and do research, it's not going to work. If you say, now you have to sit down and think, it's not going to work. On the other hand, the one who has a natural tendency for introspection and deep thought cannot be satisfied in a transactional life. And this is what makes for the very rich diversity of human activities and the perfection in each of these directions. Each has its own perfection and fulfillment. So here's the interesting part. Although we have a collective human Swadharma, within each race, within each psychological type, there are Swadharmas. And within each of those, in an individual, there is a unique particularity of Swabhava and Swadharma. And the variation and the richness is so great that you cannot find such a variety in any animal, in any other type on earth. So much so that we are even tempted to conclude that as a species, the human being is dying. Why? The logic of this is very simple. In the study of physical evolution, when you see a species is narrowing in diversity, it's a sign that it is heading for extinction. So when lions have less and less diversity of genes, their interbreeding makes for lions which cannot reproduce anymore. And you know it's the end of the species. So you have to maintain some rich variety in the genetic type. In the human being, the narrowness of the genetic type is so great that one would have concluded that it is heading for extinction. But Sri Aurobindo again gives us an insight, not here in another text, where he says that in the human being, nature has produced a physical type which is sufficiently plastic that it can hold a variety of psychological types. So evolution has shifted from dependence on physical variation to produce psychological types to now a free possibility of psychological types with the same genetic base. It's interesting. When you go back a few steps in evolution, you needed physical change to have a psychological type of variation. In the human, the base is now rich enough, plastic enough, you don't need much variation there. And so you can now spread out rapidly in psychological variations. What this means for us particularly, as in those interested in a conscious self-cultivation, it means that with the given genetic base that we have, we can actually develop a much broader and flexible psychological development if we choose to. And that's why it is extremely important in an early stage of education to give as rich and broad variety of exposure to children as possible. That although they may eventually narrow down to their own particular Swabhava and Swadharma, the base can be as broad and plastic as possible. And we must make efforts for this. This was one of the objectives of this concept of universal education, which is a relatively recent concept, barely going back 200 years, that everybody should have the same education. Earlier we didn't have that idea. We said, well, let each one have the education as needed for them in their life. But now we have this idea, everyone must go through the same textbook, the same facility, the same activities. Well, part of the truth of this is, yes, we should be able to provide the full spectrum of experience for all. But if education itself becomes narrow, we have missed that point. So, this is as regards the human Swabhava and Swadharma. And we have to conceive of it this way: the human Swabhava and Swadharma needs to be rich and diverse. Within those limits, he can extend and develop, but he cannot go outside them. Now you see what that means. Within an animal, if the limits are narrow, you can extend and develop there. But in the human, when the possibility is so much more rich, you can go much more. But you cannot go outside them. What does it mean for us to go outside the human limitation? If there is a perfection to which he has to arrive, it must be a perfection in his own kind, within his own law of being, the full play of it, but by observation of its mode and measure, not by transcendence. So, looking at the human being, if we have to attain perfection, it must be as mental beings. You cannot attain to human perfection by transcending the mind. This is the whole logic of the new step in evolution. To exceed himself, to grow into the Superman, to put on the nature and capacities of a God, would be a contradiction of his self-law, impracticable and impossible. Now remember, he is still describing that particular framework which does not accept evolution. It sees only types and maybe some pressure of change within types. Sri Aurobindo will still accept this provisionally as a valid principle. Then he will show you that the spiritual impulsion within us can now push and break beyond the boundary of this type and even grow into a new type. And this will be more possible in the human because of this greater plasticity and variety of capacity. But otherwise, this is the logic. You cannot go beyond that law, impractical and impossible. Each form and way of being has its own appropriate way of the delight of being. Now here we have to accept the reality of this, the truth of this equally, because the mass of humanity is not interested in breaking out of the human type, isn't it? Nobody says, hey, I want to become superhuman. I want to become more than intellect. I want to perfect my intellect. I want to increase my power of intelligence. That's all people look for, if at all. So what is it that makes for that to be fulfilled? And here's a very important insight. Each form and way of being has its own appropriate way of the delight of being. Each one finds his own path of fulfilling himself, enjoying himself. Enjoying is a crude word. Delight of being is the deeper truth. That in doing something you grow in the delight which gives you the enthusiasm, which gives you the enjoyment, which gives you the satisfaction of that growth. And if you go off that track, you do not have that delight. And although you may have accolades of success and praise, you do not have the enthusiasm which will make you go further. And that's why you have to grow in that particular path which is your type and your need and your line of growth of delight. Shri Krishna makes this observation in the Bhagavad Gita that it is better that you fail within your own fulfillment of Swadharma than that you are successful in somebody else's Swadharma. And this is the idea behind it. I may imitate somebody else and do better than him, but if it was not my line of development, I will ultimately lose the sense of delight, and there will not be within the joy of growth and fulfillment, and it will be inwardly a failure, although externally a success. This is one of the reasons why you see often very successful figures in society who are in severe depression or even head to commit suicide. Many film actresses and actors have major problems of depression and things like that because they've put on a fake appearance for so long that they themselves feel hollow and unfulfilled, although they've attained success in other people's eyes in terms of whatever fame or wealth. Something was out of alignment. The actors who have been successful and been happy are those who did not follow the path of what gave them the most money, but developed the line of development which took on challenging roles. fulfilling themselves in a few movies. Maybe they didn't make so much movie, but they challenged themselves to exceed in their capacity and so enjoyed the fulfillment of that growth. So each has its own appropriate way of the delight of being. When you look at a child, how can you help the child find his way? We have today this very strange career counselors. They look at the results of your examinations and say, you should be a doctor, you should be an engineer. It's not going to work. Based only on performance of certain markers, which are all superficial anyway and are pointless because they just measure memory. What about the inner drive of the person? And so often and increasingly I find today a large number of people, children who rebel against the imposed system and shut down, even have psychological problems, even eventually psychiatric problems because of this misalignment of the drive. And the first sign is they are not happy. And then you know something is wrong. So this is a very powerful reference. The way of delight of being, which is appropriate to your nature, to your type, is extremely important. Now we as adults need to view our life from this perspective. And if you find that in your life you are in a track which is not giving you that delight, deeper delight, and I don't mean a superficial, there's a delight even in facing challenges, in overcoming challenges. And so the reference of the word delight is extremely important. I have a very hard life, I'm always in opposition or struggle with my circumstances, but within there is a delight. Now you remove that opposition and struggle and the fellow will say, my life has become boring. I need something, and they'll find a problem to solve. I've seen those types. And you recognize even in the solving of problem, there's the type which is the heroic. I need the vital challenge to overcome. Or someone says, I need the intellectual understanding to overcome. There are different types. And if you can assess what it is that you need to make this worthwhile, you'll find your way. But if you're off track and something is missing, well, bring about the correction. To seek through the mind the mastery and use and enjoyment of the environment of which he is capable is rightly man, the mental being's objective. Now here's a statement which is very broad, applicable to all human type. We are mental beings. So, to seek through the mind, what? The mastery and use and enjoyment of the environment. Not through the emotions, but through the mind. If you go only through emotions or physical senses, that's not going to fulfill you. Through the mind you have to enter. First, in the three things which he describes, mastery and first is mastery. You master the environment as far as possible, whatever limited space you have. Second, use it now to fulfill yourself. And third, enjoy. The mastery and use and enjoyment of the environment of which he is capable. Not beyond what your capacity is, within the span of your capacity and realm. Sometimes we don't know what our capacity is because we've been pushed into the wrong groove. Well, you have to have some experience of the broader experimentation of capacity to discover, yes, I have this also. But the three things, you see, mastery, use and enjoyment. The enjoyment is what makes the meaning of it finally. If after mastery and use you do not enjoy, it seems pointless. And that's why in the human consciousness, and we're not speaking of the higher levels, in the mental consciousness, the enjoyment is an essential part of it. And to learn to rightly enjoy is one of the important skills we have to develop, which brings into our life a lot of the enthusiasm and joie de vivre is the word in French, joy of living. But the idea is an energy which fills your life because of the joy of living. You'll see people who live for a very old age but with a very young energy. And that's because they have this joy of living. And there are others because they have reached a point where their life has become pointless, that the enthusiasm drops, the vitality drops. And even though their genetics is able to take them far, they may end up with all kinds of problems or even shortening of life. So if you do not see something of that joy of life, which is often experienced on a vital enjoyment, which gives the enthusiasm that carries the life force, then something is missing. Not all of us are naturally vital in temperament or seek a vital enjoyment. But if there is not something of that supporting, then eventually your physical health will tend to drop. So this is still the mind's, the human fulfillment, mental being's objective. But to look beyond, to run after an ulterior object or aim of existence, to aspire to surpass the mental nature, is to bring in a teleological element into existence which is not visible in the cosmic structure. Why would you want to go beyond this to something which is not your mental capacity? Well, then means you have to say there is a larger purpose to life which is beyond mind. But where is the evidence for it? You do not see it. Remember, he is giving you that perspective. If a supramental being is to appear in the terrestrial creation, it must be a new and independent manifestation. Just as life and mind have manifested in matter, so supermind must manifest there, and the secret conscious energy must create the necessary patterns for this new grade of its potencies. So in the same way as we had the human being emerging, well, something has to eventually grow out and become that superman. But there is no sign of any such intention in the operations of nature. We do not see, for example, let's say a being or a substance which is of a fundamentally different nature than the mental, which is now growing, becoming more capable in its evolution. No such sign. But if a superior creation is intended, then certainly it is not out of man that the new grade, type or pattern can develop. For in that case, there would be some race or kind or make of human being that has already the material of the Superman in it. Just as the peculiar animal being that developed into humanity had the essential elements of human nature already potential or present in it. So now if we just accept for argument's sake that the Superman must emerge from the human, well, there has to be some sign of a race or type which is emerging. And even this he will now answer in a very skillful insight. There is no such race, kind or type. At most, there are only spiritualized mental beings who are seeking to escape out of the terrestrial creation. Look at the evidence. Wherever you find the spiritual mind, it's all talking of escape, not about growing into something higher. Now that's no more true. Now you have many more who are thinking of growing into something higher, in a large part because of Sri Aurobindo's work. If by any occult law of nature, such a human development of the supramental being is intended, it could only be by a few in humanity detaching themselves from the race so as to become a first foundation for this new pattern of being. Now here, in the very argument which is opposed to evolution, Sri Aurobindo is revealing to you the mechanism of the evolution itself. If something is like that, it is intended. By whom he is not speaking. Eventually we will see it is the secret spirit within us, the soul itself, the divine presence within, which says, mind is only one step of my journey. There is the analogy Sri Aurobindo makes, or rather the meaning that Sri Aurobindo gives to the traditional image of Vishnu's 3 steps. In the Veda, this is the vocabulary used, that Vishnu takes 3 steps. And these are the evolution of the divine consciousness as it grows to its own full revelation and mastery. And the first step is in the appearance of life on earth. The second step is the appearance of the mind. And the third step, which fulfills it, is the appearance of that supramental consciousness, where the divinity is now fully revealed. So even if we accept that there is such an intention, and it has to grow through the human, then it can be a few human beings who detach themselves from the race. so as to become a first foundation for this new pattern of being. So it's very interesting use he has of the word first foundation. So some part of humanity as if grows out, becomes a first foundation upon which higher steps can be made, out of which something of a higher grade can eventually grow out. The mother, in fact, describes precisely this as the mechanism by which the new consciousness and even a new species of humanity will grow. And she gives the analogy of the transition from the ape to the human. She says, when in nature there was that urge to push forward in the ape, a few in the ape consciousness developing this higher urge make for a very rapid growth, but very rapid. So it's not happening in the entire species, but in a few, where that push makes for a rapid growth, where the power of mind was already there as a potential, rapidly developing it, and then breaking away from the rest of the ape consciousness. And the link which appeared momentarily falls back and subsides. And Mother says exactly the same thing has to happen within the human being. Those in humanity who feel the aspiration for a higher consciousness, those in whom the urge to grow into that higher consciousness and live by it and by its truth has become strong enough, in those there will be this rapid, accelerated emergence and a kind of an emergence out of the conventional humanity, breaking through into a new grade of consciousness, and then a lapsing back that takes place. And in the lapse back, the link also breaks. But she says even that in the part of humanity which does not feel this urge, there is a fallback to the lowest common denominator of the mental life. And it stays there. And it's happy with it. And there will be a new species literally of a human type or superhuman type, supra-human type, to which the human will be what the animal is to the human today, in terms of consciousness. Why? Because it will live by the consciousness of the revealed omniscience of the divine, living in a consciousness which knows the truth at each step, not needing a rational step-by-step process, which is always in doubt and always in limitation. But whatever it chooses to know, it will have the full awareness of what it needs and the capacity to articulate to whatever degree its current development is. Now, even within the supramental being, there will be a development of capacities. But the basis of it will be not the intellect, mental intellect, but the supramental consciousness, of which intuition is an intermediate link. The human intellect can access intuition, and intuition is like a limited, reduced version of the supramental consciousness, which is inherently infinite, but the intellect is like the finite projection or ray of it. So we have this link point in between. Mind can reach intellect, intellect can reach the intuition. From intuition you can grow into supermind. And this is the link point of the passage. And what you see today in all of humanity is a tendency among the higher part of humanity to reach out to this intuitive access. In the less interested or less aspiring part of humanity, if the intuition is there, well, you have wonderful things which come from it, occasionally in flashes. But in the part of humanity which is struggling to reach some peak, whatever its field, whether in knowledge, whether in art, whether in physical prowess even, as a gymnast, or any other skill of any kind of expression, wherever there is an attempt to exceed the limits of human capacity, there is this opening to the intuition. I'm tempted to give a few examples again here, because they're so astounding and so indicative of what is possible. There is an example of a person who has developed the capacity using the sword, the traditional Japanese sword, to cut anything that is thrown at him. Well, you can throw a fruit, he will cut it in half, no big deal. But you throw a ball at him at high speed, he's able to slice it in half. Again, you can say it is within human skill. If you can hit with a bat, you can hit with a knife, a sword. But he's able to cut a bullet that is shot from a distance, which is barely visible to the eye. And when it is shot, from the moment where the sound is released and the bullet emerges, you do not have enough time to hear the sound, have the signal of the sound reach the brain, for the brain to send the electrical signals to your muscles, and for the muscle to twitch to move a heavy sword, and for the eyes to watch how the bullet is moving to bring the sword exactly in line so that it will meet the bullet exactly halfway through and cut it in half. Impossible. Physically impossible. Biologically impossible. And the man does it again and again and again without fail. In fact, the fact that he cuts the bullet is so difficult to see even that you have to use specialized cameras, high-speed cameras, to see the sword slice exactly in the half of the bullet. So here's a human being standing with his sword. The gun shoots. Your eyes cannot see the bullet. It's too fast. And his hands start moving with the full momentum required to hit and in perfect place of where the bullet is coming and slice exactly in time. You cannot do it unless there is the intuitive power. The intuitive consciousness which is identified with the shooter and the gun and the bullet and the sword equally. And literally in the training, the experience is you must become one with the sword. That's the first part. You must become one with the enemy. So that his thought and his movement of the sword is yours, and you move even as his thought moves. And before his sword moves, your sword starts moving. And that's the training. The beauty of the training is when two people who are so trained, masters, fight together, the moment the master's thought moves to move the sword, the other master's thought catches that and he begins to move his sword. And so both seem to move at the same time as if they're doing a choreographed dance. Their swords hit each other always in perfect alignment to each other, as if they're just pretending. But the reality is each one is doing something freely and the other is responding at the level of consciousness first is the true battle. All the rest is only perfect alignment with consciousness, which was the whole training of the sword master. Now this same man is tuning in to the gun shooter and the gun and the bullet to the same degree that by the time that mind moves to squeeze the trigger and the bullet is released, he has already felt and experienced the perfect alignment in which his body starts moving to meet the bullet perfectly. This is intuition. This is how the human consciousness, mind, body capacity can be lifted up beyond the intellect. And yet you're still a human being. You're not a new species. Okay? But this can be the link point from which the new transition could take place into a still higher consciousness, of which the intuition is just the ray opening to a greater dawn. If we can do this, we can certainly extend higher. And this is the beauty of the human species. We have within us the necessary plasticity to be able to exceed our limitation in consciousness. But eventually that consciousness has to seize our mind, even seize our body and nerves, to be able to act, to do what it wants to do freely. But our instrument is capable of it. It may involve a bit of struggle and effort, but it's capable. And if it can do it from the intuition is your link point to still higher grades which can take it up and do much more. Including not just the nervous movement by which you swing the sword, but even enter the cells, the muscles, the tissue and the cells and change their working from within. And by such a means, by such a process will be the transition into that supramental race or species being. At least as a first base, a first foundation of this for this new pattern of being. This example I took one because it involves the body action, but the same principle of the intuition working in every field, whether it is of knowledge, of science, or whether it is of expression of art, or it can be anything. The intuition now embedded into the physical consciousness and working through the full human instrument is your link point for the higher realm of consciousness. So, reread this line. If by any occult law of nature, and now we know there is such a law, such a human development of the supramental being is intended, It could only be by a few in humanity detaching themselves from the race so as to become a first foundation for this new pattern of being. There is no reason to suppose that the whole race could develop this perfection. It cannot be a possibility generalized in the human creature. Now, Sri Aurobindo, remember, he's still giving you that other view which is against evolution. But the truth of it now we can recognize. It is perhaps not the intention even in nature that all of humanity will make such a transition, but a significant number to form a new base. Meanwhile, the human being will still continue as one of the many types which has so far evolved, and within it the many finer variations of types which will still remain. But this new being will still be physical, not withdrawn into some subtle physical or other domain, as has been the concept in the past. Concepts, for example, in the Buddhist tradition of the rainbow body or in other similar traditions, all conceive of a withdrawal from the physical world to enter some subtler grade with a now liberated body and liberated consciousness. That's not it. Here we are speaking of a physical transition to a new grade of consciousness in which the material even of the body is awakened and an expression of that grade of consciousness. Just as our body is conscious mental tissue, mentalized tissue, so too this will be a supramentalized substance of the body. Yes.
These few detaching themselves.
Yes.
Even physically, they will become supramental?
Isn't that the logical consequence of it? That even physically you will...
paragraph before, he said it's impossible.
That's the logic. That's the logic of the non-evolutionary perspective. Remember, he was describing the viewpoint that says there is no need for evolution. You have just different types and you're bound to that type. It's impossible. But he's not saying it as his view. He's saying it as the view from that perspective. Okay? It's very important to distinguish this.
He will develop it.
He will then give you a further insight which will break that limitation. Okay? That's why the context is very important. And 2 paragraphs down, he will tell us this line of reasoning that has a considerable cogency and importance, and it was necessary to state it, even if too briefly for its importance. This is a line of reasoning. In order to meet it, he's stating this line of reasoning so that he can meet it and now counter it, which will be subsequently. But why it was important for us to go into it, because even as he describes this line of reasoning, he justifies certain principles behind it, which we have to also understand. The fact is there is a type and it is always bound within the type. But it is also possible to break out of the type, which the animal cannot do, the human can do. Because the human is so much more complex and so much more conscious. And within the human, the divine center of influence has the capacity to come forward and seize on the full personality and work through it directly, which is not there in the animals. So the truth is there. Yes, you are bound to the type, and within the type you can grow. But in the human being, while the mass of human beings will be happy to be bound within the type, there will be a few in whom there will be the urge that says, no, but I need to go further. And it is through that nature will push the way. But still, the suggestion here is it will create a first foundation. There may be several intermediate steps to pass through before the full supramentalization. And that's okay. But it will still be a narrow passage until it eventually settles into a new formation and type.
These few will be the transitory.
Yes, in transitional species is the word that Mother uses. Yes. And even levels of consciousness which may be transitional. For us right now, the immediate next step is the intuitivization of the mind. And increasingly for this intuition to fill the intellect and all of our life activities, to become the leader rather than the logic. Now, this transition itself involves a reversal. We are so used to depending on logic to justify or to be sure that in the beginning you will have an intuition which will be mixed, insecure. And the logic will be needed to validate the intuition. But there will be a gradual reversal in which the intuition will become so stable that the logic will become secondary. You use logic only to explain to others who need logic to understand. But the intuition will be your primary base of communication. And if you meet somebody else who has similarly intuitivized and lives intuition, you may still communicate through the logical step down to justify your view. Or you may directly plug in at the level of the intuition and convey something and the person gets it without needing many words. And so already just with intuitivization, you will have a grade of humanity which will begin to converse and interact with each other on values which are now radically different from the intellectual, rational, logical domain. And they may still use logic, but increasingly between themselves they won't need it. And the communication will be, someone throws an intuitive insight, it's like that, and everyone gets it, oh yeah. And then someone else throws a deeper insight or an associated new flash, what about this? And everyone says, oh yeah, flash, flash, flash. That's your conversation. Fascinating. But that's already, you can see within the human type, a level where we cannot anymore converse with the normal ranges with the same satisfaction. Although it may have a different satisfaction in expressing in logic. It's much more joyous to share among those. So you'll have perhaps many such intermediate steps which will prepare the way. So far, remember though, the whole formulation is from the point which is questioning whether there is evolution even possible. Afterwards, what he will show us, the key will be the recognition that within that energy or behind that energy which drives all these forms and makes all this possible, there is the conscious divine origin, conscious energy, which has chosen to enter into this and build from here with a purpose. And once we catch that, we will recognize, while all these mechanisms of nature, of evolution or change or growth have been described, there is this prime driver which is deep within, which can push its way and overcome these limitations and can even make transitions between species, but with brief link points, which then need not survive necessarily. And that's the reason why we do not see easily the archaeological evidence for intermediate species. And we have also mentioned last time another mechanism for evolution by which a form can be densified from a subtler grade and materialized to be introduced into the world. And so something of this the mother has suggested, that in the last step into the fully supramental being, the last step might involve such a materialization into the physical rather than an emergence from a biological birth process. So in the intuitivized states and many intermediate states, we would still have the biological birth process as a way of the species reproducing. But at some point there will be the breaking out where the new species will be able to settle directly by a kind of a base which is created by these multiple foundations. So we are at the most interesting period of human history where nature is actually pushing for this breakthrough. It means practically that this is the time in which we have the greatest potential for growth if we align ourselves to this impulse, not only of nature from below, but also of the help from above. And so a little bit of effort and you can have very rapid growth and become part of this, let's say, a few of humanity growing in this way as the precursor of a new race. It was for this reason that Sri Aurobindo was given the task. He was asked to leave the freedom struggle which he had begun in India for the larger purpose of humanity and this new step of evolution, for which a concentrated space was created here in the ashram, and as a prototype, as a focal point in which something of this new consciousness can be established, and at least early steps of these intermediate evolutionary human development could be realized. And so that's why we are here. And somewhere at the back of the mind, whatever we may do in our life, this should remain always as our reference. This is why we are here. And however long it may take in our own effort, it doesn't matter. But this is the direction in which we have to keep moving. Yes?
In what way we can be a supportive food method for Sraddhalu something in the right now speaking?
In this way, by growing in your intuitive consciousness, by opening your mind to higher states of consciousness, allowing your mind to grow in its higher possibilities, and bringing those higher or deeper states of consciousness all the way into your most material physical life and your body is working. This is the way by which we can participate in this evolution. Food. Food. Yes. So, well, if we take into account the nature, influence of environment and food, because we have discussed that, yes, certainly food can make a difference, environment can make a difference. What would work best for you would be that which allows your consciousness to become more refined, more conscious, more awake, which allows receiving higher grades of consciousness and embodying it more easily. Which food? Simply the experience of the food will tell you. What food makes you more gross and dull? What food makes you more conscious? You have to find your own way. I will not use a particular vocabulary. If you become vegetarian, you are somehow better in consciousness. Not necessarily. It can help. Yes.
Fruits and having of vegetarian.
Everything can help, but the point is, remember, you are working still within your type. If you just go into a fruitarian diet, your body type may not be able to support it. It needs denser energies also. It may need roots to compensate for a denser grade. So you cannot make a common rule. Remember, the biology type has its need. And even it would include certain types which may need some non-vegetarian food. And in saying this, there are a lot of people who get upset. But the fact is, a few people need it. They can be taught to outgrow that need. Yes, all of that is possible. But you have to understand where you are and from there build steadily in the direction without disbalancing your body. I've seen people who suddenly cut off non-vegetarian food and it created such an imbalance they couldn't function anymore. So, well, always start with the immediate practical next step. What in your diet makes you become more conscious and more effective in this alignment with the divine presence? If it makes a difference, certainly make that change of diet. If it doesn't make a difference, it doesn't matter. Your priority is still in growth of consciousness. For all the fad you may change in change of diet, your consciousness may not change at all. What's the point? So we have to be very clear of our priority. What clothing will change? Maybe nothing. Or maybe it will help you to have clothing of a certain type. The experience is your reference. And that's why you will see in their teaching, Sri Aurobindo and the mother do not make any special obsessive focus on these things. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, one should not make a fetish out of it. He repeatedly uses this phrase. So everything has a use. To the extent it helps growth of consciousness, it's useful. To the extent it harms your growth of consciousness, you have to get rid of it. That's your only reference, ultimately. Okay. We can meditate for a few minutes on this and remind ourselves of this deeper sense of purpose so that we can always hold it at the back of the mind or at the core of our being as our reference for everything we do in life.